Hello, and welcome back to Tranquility du Jour, nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson, bringing you this podcast since 2005. Today we're talking about Permission Granted, which is a new book by the lovely Regina Louise. And I invited her onto the podcast to share a bit about her new book. You're going to learn ways to self-parent, let go of those behaviors that no longer serve you, and how to grow through what you go through. Now, before we hear from Regina, I wanted to mention a few things. First of all, please hit the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode of Tranquility du Jour. Also, visit KimberlyWilson.com/podcast for more information on the podcast, including how to leave a review. Would be so grateful if you took a moment to do that. And then finally, if you are new to Tranquility du Jour, well, welcome. And you can learn more about Tranquility du Jour at KimberlyWilson.com/new. And there's also a link in the show notes, which you can find at KimberlyWilson.com/564. I want to say a big thank you to those of you who reached out after last week's podcast, Life Lately. I realized after I finished recording that night, I went to bed and it didn't get released actually until the next day. And I was like, oh, did I say too much? Did I say too little? There's this and this and this and this that I meant to mention. So I want to say a thank you to those of you who had a chance to listen and reached out about it, and to let you know I'll have a few more of those coming your way before the end of the year. So thank you for your kindness and your condolences regarding beloved Belle Starr, and then all the stuff that's going on right now, which I think many can relate to. I also want to mention that I'm busy at work on next year's year-long program. And there's a link in the show notes to join the waitlist. So you'll be the first to know when information is released in November, probably mid-November. All right, so that's it for announcements. And again, a big thank you regarding Life Lately. And excited to share Regina with you. So she is the author of Permission Granted. Her best-selling memoir, Somebody's Someone, and Someone Has Led This Child to Believe, were made into award-winning Lifetime movie, I Am Somebody's Child, the Regina Louise story, which was nominated for a 2020 NAACP Award for Best Director. A summa cum laude graduate of the California Institute of Integral Studies with a Master's of Fine Arts degree, she's a Hoffman Process teacher, workshop facilitator, and motivational speaker who lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her story has been featured in media outlets such as NPR's All Things Considered, Good Morning America, the CBS Early Show, the Tavis Smiley Show, and many more. Visit her online at IamReginaLouise.com. Welcome, Regina.
Welcome, Kimberly.
Delighted to have you here. And congrats on your latest book, Permission Granted, Kick-Ass Strategies to Bootstrap Your Way to Unconditional Self-Love. Beautiful.
I appreciate you saying as much.
So tell us about this new book and what does it mean to give permission? Why do we need permission?
Ooh, beautiful question. You're just out of the gate with this.
We don't beat around the bush here. We just go right in.
As someone who grew up in many ways beyond the margins, I cannot say that I lived in the margins. I lived on the fringe of the margins, and I had to find a way to not fall off the edge into the abyss of anonymity. And it was my responsibility to save myself. And so in doing that, without it's one thing when people say, I didn't have a book to get through life. There was no instructional manual to rear my children. Well, I recognize that there were no parents, there were no adults to model what it was to be a North Star. So I had to construct a guiding light. I had to construct it. And there was no one to ask, you know, and so throughout my life, I often wondered, did Einstein ask permission to discover the theory of relativity? Did Bill Gates ask permission to, create Microsoft and so on? And I realized that some of the greatest minds, canonized minds, revered, iconic minds, they never, ever, ever asked for permission. So why should I? They just took it. They established a norm. They established theories and ways of living in the world on their own terms. And in the case of the Stephen Hawkins and the Einsteins and so on, they took their assignment from the universe itself. So if that is true for them, why not true for me? What's the difference? So I believe it's important I couldn't surround myself with people in an embodied way who could show me a way. And I'm grateful to my intellectual capacity to learn to read at a very young age and to comprehend. And so I chose to surround myself with learned others by reading their biographies and reading the theories that they developed, the theories that they pulled down from the ethers, and gave myself permission, or rather became the permission I needed to live in this world beyond the limitations on my own terms according to universal laws.
Love it. Love it. And you're right. Other people are not necessarily asking for permission. So why? So one of the things, of course, that you talk about too is the importance of self-parenting, because as you've mentioned in your book and your memoirs, your childhood, your upbringing was quite challenging, right?
Right.
And so you talk about, and if you want to share any of that, please feel free, but tell us about the importance of self-parenting and how we do that.
Woo! Again, well, this idea of when I had my son, I was very young, in my very, very early 20s. And I was moments, if you will, out of foster care, out of a system that was not loving, that was not nurturing. But I felt that connection to affection and tenderness. And so when I had my child, no one told me how to go to him when he, in his only way of communicating, which was crying or, whining. And so I tended to his needs, and I made decisions that would affect him short term, long term. And so when I paid attention to how my body responded to his needs, I mean, we're talking my body, right? I became aware of this idea of a multi-intelligence within me and around me. And I thought, wow, if my body can respond like this to him, I know when it's time to feed him, on and on and on, then how can that serve me on my own behalf? So I learned practices to do for myself when I was experiencing grief, loss, when I yearned to be held. I learned how to hold myself and rock myself. And I learned how to I had wanted to have my son in something called the Laboyer method, which is having the baby in the water with the music. And I had wanted that so badly. But I had preeclampsia toxemia when he was in utero. So it was too dangerous for me. And plus, he came a month early. But I thought of the natural intelligence of that for myself. So I learned how when I became activated, which before I went into therapy, I was activated by everything in life. Hallmark commercials, mother and daughter, father, all of it was triggering for me and I didn't understand why. So I learned to, as I was saying, go back into water that was at the temperature of the body and, submerge myself in it with soothing music playing to help regulate my central nervous system. And all of this was intuitive. The research wasn't around back then and what we know about the brain and neuroplasticity and, creating new neural pathways. So naturally, that's what I learned to do there was a time, and I'm going to keep it real, where I went out in my 30s and I bought a baby bottle and I watched how, feeding my child had soothed him. And when I got really, really upset, I just drank it. I got a pacifier and I naturally taught myself to self-soothe because to me, when one is born into the type of desperation, the type of coming into the world feeling that existential angst and having annihilation, the probability of annihilation or the fear of annihilation, riding shotgun every day of one's life. I mean, when was the fight or flight ever turned off? So I've done whatever it has taken on my own terms to re-educate my body, my central nervous system in ways to be safe in the world. So I have taken it to a whole.
Absolutely. Well, so interesting, right? To remind ourselves to pay attention. What are the triggers? And do we have to continue to be affected by those? Or can we learn, as you talk about in the book, de-escalation techniques, right? And, I do think this idea of reparenting, connecting to your inner child, which you also talk about in the book, so important. So can you share a few more de-escalation techniques that you have found helpful, particularly as you're responding to everyday triggers?
Yes. I mean, there are many, as you know, but one of the practices that I use every day is this idea of the love of compassion. And I see compassion, I understand it rather as a desire to alleviate one's own suffering as well as someone else's suffering. And the love of compassion, the idea is once the trigger has, is out of the gate, is off and running, once we're triggered and the amygdala is activated and it's a, fight or flight or fawn or freeze situation. I'm a fawner. I used to fight and then I flew, and now I'm more like a fawner. But anyway, one of the things that is very helpful is this idea of the love of compassion. So, with the love of compassion in the moment, it's that ability to take a breath, exhale, and go to L, right? The love of compassion. And then that L invites us to land in our bodies, on our sit bone, feet on the ground, chest open, and listen. Listen for what is happening in the body. And then leaning into the places that are activated. And then observe. Observe my part in it, your part in it. Observe what is happening in the moment. Is there grief? Is there sadness? Is there tension? And whatever is there, open to that. Allow the feeling. Allow whatever it is. And recognize and be willing to step into your vulnerability. It's okay to be vulnerable, to normalize, to privilege one's own vulnerability. And then to go to the E, which is to have empathy. So the love of compassion invites us with E to get off our back and get on our sides and sit in the foxhole with ourselves. So if we land open, become aware of our vulnerability, and met out empathy to ourselves, that in and of itself is a practice in alleviating our own suffering. And that in and of itself is the definition of compassion. So what we've just done is we've become for ourselves what we need most. And what is love, right? What really is love? And I look at love as a tenderness, a willingness to be affectionate and to render from the heart and soul of emotional goodness, this outpouring, this outflowing of that emotional goodness to ourselves.
Gotcha. Yeah. And, for any of our listeners who are like, what's fawn, right? Because we all know fight, flight, freeze. So you say you're more of a fawn. So tell us what that is.
Right. When someone accused me of it, I became so defensive. I did not know what to do with myself. So a fawner is someone who will do anything to keep the peace. It's okay. No. You're right. No, you know what? Absolutely. You know what? But you privilege the other person's perspective, no matter how threatening or dangerous or, inappropriate it may be. And at the end of the day, there's so much that happens in the fawning process, because in the fawning response, one of the biggest things we do is abandon ourselves, abandon our needs, abandon our voice, abandon our sovereign right to speak up. But people who fawn, I most definitely, it's a survival strategy. It's a way to stay safe. It's a way to not have to go in the moment, to go in to negotiating on my own terms. It actually represses agency like nobody's business. So it's a strategy that clearly is learned, and especially in dealing with people who have patterns of narcissism. Fawning is very common for those of us who identify with patterns of codependency, right? And have learned that in terms of those who have patterns of narcissism, without you, I'm nothing. So when that person who exhibits tendencies of narcissism, everything is about them, inability to see you, inability to take any onus for their part in anything, especially if something goes wrong. So for those of us who have had patterns of being narcissistic supply, meaning we're the cheerleaders of the narcissist. Why? Because we are queen fawners. We know what the narcissists want. We know how to fan the flames of that fragile, fragile ego, that fragile, fragile, oftentimes sense of self, if there's even a sense of self, online.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get it, right? And that's where the idea of, fawning all over her, right? So I get it. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting too, Regina, is that makes me think about communication styles, right? And there's like passive aggressive, assertive, and aggressive. I'm sure there's many others, but those are kind of like the main ones. And it's like, okay, fawning, you're more in the passive realm. And it's like, how do I move more into the assertive to express my needs, to say like, actually, it isn't my fault. I don't know if you saw, but in the previous email, I was very clear. Do you know what I mean? Versus like, oh yeah, I clearly like was not clear enough.
Right.
Right?
Taking the onus and being, well, there comes a time, I would imagine, at least in my own life, where, is it Anais Nin who says,
Love her, by the way.
right, right? But I hope I don't slaughter this quote, but there comes a moment where it's far more painful for the rose to stay closed than it is to blossom. And I think that's true, right? For so many of us. There comes that moment when we must stand for ourselves. And I can remember as an adult, my biological sister came to visit, and I was terrified of her. I had never lived with her. We didn't have the kind of history that would liken itself to having that safety and saying, I don't like it when you do this, So I was a cheerleader. Oh my God, you're so amazing. Look at you. I paid for her to come. I just gave and gave and gave. And at the time she visited, I was very newly married with my little baby, and all the furniture in my house was white. And I bought her clothes. I made her room, her guest room, fit for a queen. And then when she came, I purchased her an outfit it was dyed ink, and the ink was blue, and the fabric dye was blue ink. And she would lay on my white sofa. And I didn't know really what depression was, because in my mind, I've never had the luxury to be depressed. So she wouldn't get off the sofa. And like for a week, my sofa was black, and I didn't know how to say, can you not wear, I didn't know what to say, but I could see that I didn't like my sofa, but I didn't want my sister to be angry. I didn't want to lose the connection, which is what I've learned, even though I didn't even understand what the connection was. And then that day, that moment came where I said, I would like it if you wouldn't wear that outfit on my sofa. And of course, what I feared happened. The defensiveness, the on and on and on. And then to get caught. And I didn't understand boundaries back then. So I would say it's understanding what we want, and then to underscore what we want with boundaries, and be willing to sit in the discomfort, which again, if we go back to the love of compassion, it strengthens our resolve, and it strengthens our natural capacity to sit in the discomfort and know I don't diminish my value, my self-worth, my who I am does not diminish as a result of letting you know where I end and you begin. That's a boundary where one begins and the world ends, and vice versa, where one ends and the world begins. And I would say in my lifetime, boundaries are what has kept me safe in one shape, form, or another, even when I did not know that having a no was a boundary.
I love this because boundaries are so important. And really, whenever I think about the idea of fawning and narcissists and what have you, it's setting these boundaries. It's all about boundaries. So I'm curious, as someone who struggled with boundaries, who I don't think I know any female who doesn't struggle with boundaries to some degree, right? How did you get past that? How did you learn to set them? Because I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to this struggle.
Right. I like I said, I started that day. Well, if I go back to being the little girl at 11 and when my abusers, you know, abused me, there came that moment where I said no. And at that time, when I look back, I aligned my value and my intention with something higher and greater than me in the moment. So I made a pact with God. And so for me as a young girl to make a pact with the almighty invisible, I mean, that takes a lot of chutzpah. That takes a lot of moxie to make a pact with something we can't see. And then to believe that in and of itself is immeasurably powerful. So when I saw that I could make that pact and say, if you hit me again, I'm leaving. And I did it. And I didn't die. I didn't really lose anything. Sure, I never saw my family again, but I determined to do that. Right. I'm like, I would rather take my chances in the world than to know what's going to happen within this milieu. I'm never going to make it to young adulthood without 15 children by 15 different men if I don't get out of here. And not to mention, I'm going to be beaten into a state of ugly. It's just not going to be a good situation. So at 11, and I wrote about my life as a young girl in my first book, Someone. But it was when over the years I thought about, do you recognize what you did at 11? Do you really see it? And I didn't understand the value of it because we live in a culture that doesn't always privilege stories of people who look like me. So even the first critic who really got my whole book wrong because it said I grew up in Chicago when in fact I grew up in Austin, which told me, did you really read that? But anyway, they said, unfortunately, not an unusual story. And I thought, but why isn't my story unusual? Why isn't it unusual that a little girl at 11 had to take her life into her own hands? So I was always suspect of that. Like, why is it because I'm Black that it wasn't unusual? And that's what it was. So over the years, I had to think about it. Wait. You're wrong. That was unusual. It was unusual for me to have to save my own life. And so when I went back to this book, Permission Granted, I recognize the power of an 11-year-old girl. I mean, it was okay for Huck, right? Huck could go and make an effort to overturn the consciousness of a slavery supporting South. Like at 8, 9, and 10, that was great for him. But in real life, for a young girl, a young Black girl, to not privilege that narrative, I thought I must go back. I must look at that. So when I look back on that as the adult that I am now, I wanted to make sure that this time I privileged the narrative and I really spent time in giving the reader a more complex look into the mindset and the heart set of what it is when one is connected to the truth and value of who they are, which I believe my 11-year-old.
Yeah, what a powerful 11-year-old. Oh my goodness. Well, and before I ask you my last question, Regina, is there anything else that you would like to share about this beautiful book, Permission Granted, before my final question?
Mm. You know, one of the I feel so blessed to get so far so many favorable reviews. Like I'm actually blown away. And so when I take all the reviews that the book has been receiving and notice how I'm making the distinction between what I'm receiving and the book is receiving, and it's important because whatever happens to the book, that's important about the book. I am a separate entity. I think it's important to make the distinction. I am not giving anyone or telling anyone, I'm not giving anyone permission. And I think that's a small consideration that deserves rather to take the time to pull that apart. There is a offering in the book to write your own permission statement because what I've learned as an inspiration and motivational speaker, it's not my job to tell you who you are and what to do, but what it is my choice to give myself permission to show up as my highest possibility. So this book is about mirroring. It's saying from the jump, the choice is yours. And so this book is really, in my opinion, an invitation into the choice to take the reins of your life and do it on your terms, maybe for the first time in your life, and to get a taste of that, to get a taste of what it is like to live life from the perspective, because it was initiated in the mind of an 11-year-old, to live life from the perspective of a spirit embodied 11-year-old who gave herself permission and dared to grow herself up despite the prognosis of what her life would be.
Wonderful. I love that idea of it's like we don't need anyone else's permission, right? It's like, how do we find that within?
Yes.
And my last question for you, Regina, is the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour. So I always like to ask my guests, how do you find tranquility in your everyday?
Wow, what a question, right? How do I find tranquility in my everyday affairs? You know, tranquility for me, Kimberly, is as close to me in every moment as my breath. So if you notice, the tone of my voice just changed. And I'm tuning in to my voice. I'm tuning in to how my body is positioned on the chair and my central nervous system. I'm tapping in more to the vagal nerve and I'm calm. So tranquility is as close to me in any moment of my existence as I am willing to stop lessen my engagement, my outward expression, and become aware of my interior. So, in the question, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, is always the answer. And now, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, the answer is in the question. So, as you posited, how do I relate with tranquility in my everyday life? I am giving an example of tranquility.
Beautiful. Thank you. Love me some Thich Nhat Hanh and Anais Nin. So I love that you brought both of them up today. Well, thank you so much, Regina, for being here with us. And congrats again on this beautiful book, Permission Granted, Kick-Ass Strategies to Bootstrap Your Way to Unconditional Self-Love.
And Kimberly, again, thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of this courageous attempt to make, strategic meaning of my lived experience. Thank you for sharing your platform with this book. I am grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So there's links in the show note to find our guest on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, a link to her new book, Permission Granted. Also, let's stay connected. We can do so through regular love notes, which are invites, inspiration, and more. Also, there's a link to my 6 books and planner, ways to follow along on the Facebook group, which I am fading out of Facebook, so we'll see if that will keep going. Also Instagram and of course YouTube. There's also a link to shop seasonless, vegan, locally made, eco-friendly fashion, TDJ by Kimberly. And if you didn't get to see the pop-up event that happened last week, definitely check it out at kimberlywilson.com/TDJ style, and just gives insights onto capsule wardrobe dressing. And that's it. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and inviting me and my guest into your home.